In 2015, a 31-year-old woman in a black turtleneck was on the cover of Forbes, Fortune, and Time. Investors handed her $9 billion in company valuation. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes. Her company, Theranos, claimed it could run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood. There was just one problem: the technology didn't work. It never really did. So how did some of the smartest investors on the planet, people who do this for a living, miss it? They didn't miss it because they were stupid. They missed it because of a mental shortcut baked into every human brain. A shortcut that's tricking you right now. Today, in job interviews you'll sit through, products you'll buy, and people you'll trust or distrust in the next 5 seconds of meeting them. It's called the halo effect. And by the end of this video, you won't be able to unsee it in other people and in yourself. Let's get into it. The halo effect is a cognitive bias where one positive trait about a person or a company or a product bleeds over and colors our judgment of totally unrelated traits. Think of it like this. If someone is physically attractive, we unconsciously assume they're also smarter, kinder, more trustworthy, and more competent, even though looks tell you nothing about intelligence or honesty. One good trait creates a halo around the whole person. And it works in reverse too. That's sometimes called the horn effect. One bad trait, and suddenly we assume the person is bad at everything else. This isn't a modern internet phenomenon. It's not about influencers or Instagram filters. This bias was scientifically documented over 100 years ago, and it has been reconfirmed in study after study ever since. Let's look at the actual evidence. Evidence number 1. Thorndike's original 1920 study. The term halo effect comes from American psychologist Edward Thorndike. In 1920, he published a study called A Constant Error in Psychological Ratings. Here's what he did. He asked commanding officers in the military to rate their subordinates on intelligence, physique, leadership, and character, without ever having spoken to them. Now think about that. These officers were judging men on intelligence and character, traits you can't actually see, based purely on appearance. The result? Officers who were rated as taller and more physically attractive were also rated as more intelligent and better soldiers. There was no logical reason for this. Height has nothing to do with intelligence. But the correlations between these supposedly independent traits were far too high to reflect any real, independent judgment, proving the officers weren't evaluating each trait on its own merit. They were forming one overall impression and applying it everywhere. That's the birth of the halo effect as hard data, not just a hunch. Evidence number 2. Nisbett and Wilson's 1977 experiment. Fast forward to 1977, psychologists Richard Nisbett and Timothy Wilson ran a now famous experiment. They had participants watch a videotaped instructor who was presented as either warm or cold in personality, then asked them to rate the same instructor's physical appearance, mannerisms, and even his accent. Here's the unsettling part. It was the exact same video of the exact same person. The only thing that changed was whether participants were told he was warm or cold beforehand. People who thought he was warm rated his appearance and voice as more pleasant. People who thought he was cold rated the same appearance and same voice as more irritating. And most participants had no idea their judgment had been manipulated at all. They were convinced they were rating him objectively. That's the scariest part of the halo effect. It doesn't feel like bias. It feels like observation. Let's move from the lab to the real world, specifically the corporate world where the halo effect has cost people fortunes. Business professor Phil Rosenzweig wrote an entire book about this called The Halo Effect and the 8 other business delusions that deceive managers. His prime example is Cisco Systems. In the late 1990s, during the dot-com boom, Cisco was considered one of the greatest companies in business history. Under CEO John Chambers, Journalists and researchers praised Cisco endlessly for its brilliant strategy, masterful handling of acquisitions, and superb focus on customers. A 1997 magazine article even described the company culture as full of joyful, energetic employees. Then the dot-com bubble burst in 2000. Cisco's stock crashed. And almost overnight, the story flipped. The same journalists and researchers who once praised Cisco's strategy now claimed the company had a flawed strategy, disorganized acquisitions, and poor customer relationships. Here's the question Rosenzweig asks: did Cisco's leadership, culture, and strategy actually change that dramatically in such a short time? On closer examination, Cisco hadn't really changed much at all. It was the decline in financial performance that changed how people perceived the company, and Cisco went on to stage a strong recovery, remaining one of the leading tech companies for years after. This is the halo effect operating at a massive scale. When a company is winning, everything about it looks brilliant. When it's losing, the exact same practices suddenly look incompetent. We don't evaluate strategy and culture independently. We infer them backward from the outcome, then convince ourselves we saw it coming. This is exactly what happened with Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, which we opened this video with. She had the Stanford dropout story, the Steve Jobs-style black turtleneck, an unusually deep and commanding voice, and total, unshakable confidence when she spoke. Investors and board members, including former U.S. Secretaries of State, didn't independently verify the science. The confidence and image created a halo, and people extended that trust to a claim that should have demanded hard proof, a machine that, according to later investigations and a criminal fraud conviction, simply could not do what she said it could. One convincing trait, confidence, quietly vouched for everything else. Example number 2. Everyday life. Attractiveness and snap judgments. You don't need to run a company to fall for this. It happens in ordinary daily life constantly. Decades of psychological research on attractiveness, BIAs, have found a consistent pattern. People who are considered physically attractive are generally judged to be friendlier, more competent, and more successful than people seen as average-looking or unattractive, even when there's zero actual evidence connecting looks to those traits. Researchers even gave this pattern a nickname: what is beautiful is good. Think about how this plays out in your own life. In a job interview, an interviewer forms a first impression in the first few seconds, based on a firm handshake, a nice smile, good posture, and that first impression quietly colors how they interpret every answer the candidate gives afterward. A confident, well-dressed candidate's shaky answer gets read as he just phrased it awkwardly. The same shaky answer from someone who seems nervous or is dressed poorly gets read as he doesn't actually know the material. In the classroom, teachers have been shown to rate the same essay differently depending on whether they're told it was written by a good student or a struggling one. The halo from a student's reputation shapes the grade on completely unrelated work. Even in courtrooms, mock jury studies have repeatedly found that more physically attractive defendants tend to receive more lenient judgments and lighter sentences than less attractive defendants for the exact same alleged crime. None of this is because people are deliberately unfair. It's because the brain is wired to build one coherent story about a person, and it fills in the blanks using whatever trait is most visible first. A face, a voice, a confident tone, a reputation. Why your brain does this, and how to fight it. So why does the brain do this? Psychologist Daniel Kahneman explains it simply. Your brain hates uncertainty and loves a coherent story. Forming a complete impression from one strong signal is cognitively cheap. Actually evaluating a person's intelligence, honesty, and competence separately, with evidence for each, is slow and effortful. So the brain takes the shortcut. The problem is, shortcuts that feel accurate aren't the same as shortcuts that are accurate. Here's how you actually push back against it. Separate the traits on purpose. Before judging someone's competence, ask, am I rating this based on actual evidence, or based on how they looked, sounded, or made me feel? Judge one attribute at a time, blind if possible. This is why many orchestras started holding auditions behind a screen so judges couldn't be influenced by appearance. And it's part of why more women began being selected for top orchestra positions once that first impression was physically removed from the process. Distrust your first 30 seconds. Not because first impressions are always wrong, but because they're persuasive far beyond what they actually prove. Ask, what's the specific evidence? Before you extend trust in one area because someone impressed you in a completely different area. So finally, Elizabeth Holmes is in prison. Cisco survived its crash and became a giant again. Thorndike soldiers were never actually smarter for being taller. The instructor in Nisbett and Wilson's tape was the same man on every single screen. The halo effect isn't a flaw in a few gullible people. It's a feature of every human brain, including yours and mine. The people who avoid its worst damage aren't the ones who think they're immune to bias. They're the ones who know it's there and check for it anyway. So next time someone walks into a room and you instantly like them, or instantly, don't pause for 1 second and ask yourself, is this evidence, or is this just a halo? If this video opened your eyes even a little, hit subscribe, because next week we're breaking down another bias that's quietly running your decisions without your permission.